I welcome all of you to this traditional prayer breakfast we have. It's one of my favorite mornings of the year. We are so lucky to have people from all over. Do we have Mike? Thank you, David. We have leaders from Waterbury and Watertown, and I'm delighted to have all of you. I always feel that our students are going to be at their best behavior when we have this many cops in the room. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I'm particularly happy that Commissioner Esty is here and will address us. Also, the mayor from Waterbury. We are really so fortunate when we have some of the leaders from the local area and great friends in this room. I also love it when we have alumni come back, and we have Shanika and Daquan and AJ, I think, are all here. I just actually want to welcome you. Where are they? You three back. Well, nice to have you back on campus. What we do here is this. We try to, how's my voice over there? We want, on an event like this, to do something profound and obvious, and that is obviously we want to somehow honor the legacy of Martin Luther King. And as a school, I think it's really filled with critical thinkers and very bright people. We use that and we leverage it. And this year we leveraged it to ask some questions about environmental justice. And I think to do that is a little bit unusual. I don't know that every school does it. We've tried to say the true way to honor this man's leadership is to ask very difficult questions, and they may not always be the ones that are asked every year. And so this year we asked questions about what does it mean to have justice? In what way does environmental policy shape poverty, shape opportunities? We had an amazing presentation last night from Majora, and we are going to continue that conversation when Commissioner Esty speaks. So I welcome all of you, and I just would ask if Chaplain Bob Ganung would lead us in a prayer. Bob?
I think it's appropriate on Martin Luther King Prayer Breakfast that we begin with prayer. So if you could join me together, join with me in heart and mind, body and soul, let us pray. Gracious God of many names and of all the people, we gather this morning as citizens, civic workers, community organizers, clergy, faculty, and students, not only to honor and remember the legacy of Dr. King, but to recommit ourselves to social justice ministries and to offer ourselves in your service. Oh God, we truly desire to be your hands and feet at work in the world. Empower us to be champion civil rights and human rights, to join voices with the poor and oppressed and the marginalized among us. Strengthen us to be your peacemakers in a world where wars and armed conflicts still rage. Help us to see that fighting endless wars is futile, destructive to the human community, to all sentient beings on this green and blue planet, our Mother Earth, the only Earth that we have. Help us to heed the prescient words of Dr. King, that all life is interrelated, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny, and therefore whatever affects one affects the destiny of all. Oh God, Dr. King called us never to be afraid to do what's right, to have the courage to speak truth to entrench power when the well-being of people, animals, and the earth itself is in jeopardy. And Dr. King reminded us that the damage we do to our souls when we look away and are indifferent is far greater than any punishment society or the status quo can inflict upon us. God of life and love, compassion and mercy, it was a half century ago that Dr. King said these far-sighted and percipient words: our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men. We know these intuitive words speak to our times even more than they did in King's day. We pray that beginning today we will rise up with courage and a mighty strength with women and men from every nation on this planet to establish as our first priority the creation of a just, equitable, and sustainable world where all people, all sentient beings, and Mother Earth herself are treated with nobility and dignity. And we recognize the inherent intrinsic value in all things. As we remember and celebrate Dr. King's vision for a more inclusive and compassionate America and world in our challenging times, remind us that Dr. King was a tireless advocate for not just civil and human rights, but the rights of animals, all life forms, and this precious earth we call home. Great God of transformative power, open our hearts, minds, and souls today Enable us to learn and grow in truth and love together. Amen.
Lift every voice and sing until earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on until victory is won.
Doesn't that make you just want to sing? God, that was beautiful. Thank you, guys. Well done. Music has been part of this morning since as long as I can remember. It was part of our night last night. It was wonderful last night to hear you speak and to have that framed, if you will, by the gospel choir, and the sense of celebration on the campus is tremendous. One way I celebrated this morning was I came down in the hall and I met Commissioner Esty. And I followed his career, but I don't know that many of you know that this is a coming home for him. And just now, Al Reef came up to say hello to him because they played together when they were boys, because Dan grew up on this campus when his father, John, was the headmaster from 1962 to 1972. And so really, Dan, this is a welcome back to Taft. Great to have you back at Taft. So, great. Dan's career has been a remarkable one, and he's been an incredible public servant, and he's an amazing scholar. He has degrees from Yale, from Harvard. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and he's been the Commissioner on Energy and Environmental Protection in Connecticut for the last 3 years. He's a professor at Yale. Yale was lucky enough to have him, and then generous enough to loan him to the state, where he's done incredible work. He is well known nationally and also regionally. He has been on the Colbert Report. He's been profiled in Wall Street Journal, New York Times. He's been on the O'Reilly Factor. This is one of the real leaders in environmental policy. And so I hope you'll welcome Dan warmly, and also with a sense that we are just incredibly fortunate to have a man who served the way he has and to be back on our campus. So with that, Dan, welcome back home.
Headmaster McMullen, Dean Lee, thank you for including me here today. Thank you all for coming. It is a homecoming, and as I walked into your headmaster's office, I was taken back 45 years to my 9-year-old self. And I could see that office as I saw it when my father was there, but I could also smell the pipe smoke that my father smoked in that office. Now you might think, why is Commissioner Esty telling us this? Because what the headmaster said to me, well, everybody smoked a pipe back then. And it was true. And it was horrible. Clouds of smoke were acceptable. I think, in fact, the teachers could smoke in the classrooms. It is amazing to think how far we've come on the issue of smoking in those 4 decades. It is amazing to think, and that's what I want to talk about today, how you bring about change. Because, as all of you know, Martin Luther King was not just a great civil rights leader. And for me to come here to celebrate his life and his legacy is appropriate. I was a 9-year-old boy when he died. I was here on this campus when I heard about that loss. So it is appropriate to come back and celebrate him, not just as a civil rights leader, but really much more than that, as a leader of change. as someone who is committed to making his community and his society a better place. And that's what I think all of us are called upon to do in honoring Martin Luther King's legacy. Now, the chaplain already offered a quote, which I want to repeat, because it signals that Martin Luther King understood not only the essence of civil rights, but the essence of sustainability, or of the environment, which is what I know is a theme of your program today. So Martin Luther King did tell us it really boils down to this: all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one destiny affects all indirectly. And that is, of course, the essence of what the environmental challenge is about. The change that has occurred in teaching us that it's not okay to smoke because you're blowing smoke in someone else's face is the same change we have to understand in the environmental arena. It's not okay to pollute because it's not only your own world you're polluting, it's everyone else's as well. We all do share that garment of destiny. So it's in a spirit of appreciating Martin Luther King's focus on action and commitment to change and social progress that I want to highlight some of what I think is required to bring that spirit to bear in the environmental arena. And I want to say to those who think about the environment, it is a wonderfully complicated, challenging, and important place to devote your own efforts at social change. But for those who this is not the passion of your life, pick your own area, because there are many. There are many places where we need to bring to bear a spirit of transformation, a spirit of change, and all of us have a role to play in our communities and some on a broader scale at trying to bring forth those changes we need to ensure that we do bring forth the spirit of Martin Luther King and a better society across many arenas. So I do think that as we look out at our current day and our current age, the issue of environment does stand out as one where we need to continue to push, because there is a huge injustice where harms are caused by some and the burden is borne by others, where cleanup is paid for by some, often those least well prepared to pay. So there is a fundamental issue of how we get to a society where environmental protection is accepted as the norm, paid for particularly by those who cause the harm, and where we are careful to ensure that the least well positioned to protect themselves don't bear the burden because the society has decided to let harms fall as they will. So it really is a fundamental question of rethinking how we approach environmental challenges. And I want to speak to you a little bit about those challenges and then share just a couple of minutes about what I have tried to do in the state of Connecticut over the past 3 years as the commissioner of a newly created Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And one of the things that, again, that quote from Martin Luther King reminds us is interconnectedness. And that is part of my vision of environmental protection, is to look for and then manage interconnectedness. And so when Governor Malloy first asked me now 3 years and a bit ago whether I would consider leaving my post as a professor at Yale and coming to help him try to transform Connecticut state government, I said to him at the time, Governor, I would be honored to do it, but I think I would be more effective if you would consolidate an environment department that exists with energy responsibilities that are scattered across state government and not being systematically managed. What I said to the governor, and I think he knew it and believed it and therefore did it, was that energy and environment are deeply intertwined. And a significant part of our environmental challenge comes from the choices we make about how to create the energy of our society, how we keep the lights on, how we have our cars move, how we heat the buildings, how we drive the industries that are in this area. So there are real choices, and I think we do need to think of this as an integrated package. So the governor did create a Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, DEEP. But as I like to joke, I spell that acronym DEEP with 3 E's. Energy, the environment, and the economy. Because it turns out the success on addressing environmental challenges, on shifting the energy foundation of our society, depends on keeping an eye at every moment on the economic impacts of those choices and on ensuring that you've got the economic incentives to drive change properly structured. So I have, every day I've been commissioner, talked about the 3 E's of my deep department. And I do think we are starting to get some traction with the idea that energy, the environment, and the economy need to be understood as interrelated challenges, unlikely to be successfully addressed if taken apart and thought about on their own. But let's look out at the challenges. Some of the challenges are, frankly, entirely local. So it was a thrill to hear that you have a sustainability coordinator on this campus, because it all starts where you live. And if you don't manage your own waste, and you don't look to recycle, and you don't look to protect your open spaces and keep your parks and forests looking as they should, available for access, there will be challenges. So a good amount of the challenge in the environmental arena is very much local, some of it even within the house or the home or the building you live in. Second of all, there are issues like toxics that a lot of us are beginning to recognize is an issue of concern. Chemical exposure is not to be trifled with. And this is a great challenge too, and it brings up a second principle of change that I think matters. And that is that we need to watch the data. We need to recognize that there is a revolution going on in our society, a revolution that's bringing big data to bear, not always in good ways, but in ways that are transformative. And we in the environmental arena have done too little to get at that data and make it work for us. And here's how. We have, in the last 40 years, set up a structure of environmental law and policy that works on averages. It says, on average, people can be exposed to this much harm. But let me tell you, the average is not right for everyone. There is a subset of the population that is more highly exposed, that faces a disproportionate burden from pollution. And there are people as well who, if hit with an average amount of pollution, will suffer a lot because of their own body makeup. So we need to become much more sophisticated in our society in tracking where harms are, who's affected, and by how much, and become able to use this big data to tailor individual circumstances in ways that will address individual harms and burdens. And that is a huge challenge for the 21st century. But again, for those of you who are interested in computers and big data, maybe the place to play that out is in this environmental arena. You know, every manager of every baseball team uses data now to pick the players. How about picking pollution standards with a little bit of that same care and attention? We also know that some problems are regional. Water pollution requires dealing across a watershed. Everyone who lives or dumps pollution into that river needs to be drawn into a circle of care. A shared space needs to be managed in a shared way. And that's true of airsheds as well as watersheds. And I do think we are reminded constantly of what happens if there is inattention to those shared spaces. My thoughts this past week have been with the people of West Virginia who have seen their water taken away. Their water taken away. You know, the fact we have water on this table is taken for granted. Not in West Virginia today. There is real worry about what has happened as a chemical tank was under-regulated, under-managed, allowed to fracture, and contaminated an entire river and watershed, producing a water problem for nearly 1 million people. That's a big deal, and that's why we have environmental regulators, environmental rules, environmental standards, and a need for environmental agencies to enforce them. I also want to say that some problems are national. Our markets are national, and therefore the action to respond to certain issues needs to be national. Again, I think about food safety, an issue that's emerged with great force. We have a national food system. And by the way, we're going to learn this over the coming months because there's a terrible drought starting in California where 2/3 of our fruits and vegetables come from. So by this summer, we're going to be facing a crunch all across this country. But it's not just the fact that food comes from faraway places. It's that we need to be careful about where food comes from, what chemicals are in it, what pesticides are on it, And I think we have, again, work to do in ensuring that that kind of issue is taken care of. And all of these represent challenges that I hope someone in this room will step up to. Someone will make their part of that garment of destiny. It's also the case we need to focus on agricultural sustainability, because one of the great challenges of the environment is not just to get it right for today, but for tomorrow and for the rest of the century and for 1,000 years to come. The challenge that I want to talk about in great detail, or in greater detail today, is a global challenge. It's the challenge of climate change. And this is the challenge that perhaps brings to the fore environmental justice in the greatest scale. All of the other problems are ones where there will be winners and losers, people who are affected if the problem's not dealt with, all of us who will be affected if the problem is dealt with, costs to be borne by those who are asked to change their behavior to deal with a problem. But the problem of climate change has an even bigger dimension of environmental justice, which is an intergenerational dimension. So those of us who are here today emitting the greenhouse gases that are trapped in our atmosphere, leading, as it appears, to a slow process of change, which, by the way, we should call climate change and not just global warming, because the issues that emerge first will probably not be related to warming. They will be things like more intense hurricanes and windstorms, more frequent hurricanes and windstorms. So I became commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection in 2011. 25 years since the state of Connecticut had been hit by a hurricane. We were hit by 2 such storms in the last 3 years. So it does appear, although we can't say for sure, that those first signals of potentially changing climate are coming. And again, it will be global warming, it'll be sea level rise, it'll be changed rainfall patterns. One has to be ever so slightly worried that this drought in California, the lack of snowpack in the Sierras, is another signal of change emerging. So again, I know that you've got environmental classes here and opportunities to think about these issues, but climate change is a particularly tough issue. It is a problem that is impossible to see. That is to say, we can't watch the buildup of greenhouse gases. The first generation of environmental challenges were plainly visible. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire. That was vivid. Everyone could get it. And even when the problem in West Virginia has broken out in the last week, the water may not look polluted, but it smelled polluted. Everybody got that. Climate change, much tougher. Invisible, spread across space, across the entire planet. In fact, I hope you all know this. Greenhouse gases emitted here in Connecticut today will blend with other greenhouse gases and blanket the Earth. Impossible to stop that spread across the entire planet. So you can't say, well, let's do our part, fix our piece. Let's make Connecticut greenhouse gas free. Won't solve our problem. Again, it is that interconnectedness that Martin Luther King reminded us of that makes this a global scale challenge that requires both a global scale perspective, but at the same moment, local and national action. So I think we know that we have a big problem here, but there is a big challenge of continuing to frame it, to understand it, to make it visible when it is invisible. And that requires getting the science right. It also requires us, and I think this is perhaps to some going to sound a little off kilter, but it requires us to acknowledge not just what we know, that there is a problem of climate change, that it's a complicated, tricky problem, but to acknowledge what we don't know. So for example, we know that the greenhouse effect is real. Otherwise, our planet would be uncomfortably, in fact, uninhabitably cold. So we must have those greenhouse gases as part of what makes this planet work for humanity and for all the species that Martin Luther King talked about in his reverence for life. But we also know some things with a little less certainty. We know that the buildup of greenhouse gases is causing these effects, this warming, these changes in patterns. But here's what we don't know. We don't know the pace at which climate change might occur. We don't know the scale or the magnitude that it's going to hit with. And we don't know who's going to get hit hardest. Although we're beginning to realize there probably will be differential effects. For example, harder hit on the equatorial latitudes, Again, raising a question of environmental justice, because the emissions come largely from people living in more distant latitudes, Europe, the United States, emerging Asia. But the impacts may well be across those in the equatorial zone, some of the poorest countries in the world being in that zone. So how do we address this problem that has got not only a distribution of harms that may be uneven and unfair, but a reality which is that the biggest impacts may still be 50 or 100 years away, a generation or 2 or 3 into the future? What do we owe in the way of environmental justice to those who are not just our children, our grandchildren, but in some cases our great-grandchildren and beyond? And how do we motivate action today when the threat is so widely spread and in some regards so distant through time? I think that is the kind of challenge that is worthy of, I hope, some of you in this room. It will require becoming masters of the science, as I said, becoming better at managing data, at doing risk analysis. It will require a creativity to think about solutions, perhaps ones we haven't yet imagined. It will require an attention to cost and economics. And I will tell you, one of the strongest conclusions I have from 25 years working in this arena is that it's not good enough to highlight a problem. It's not good enough to say that there is a cost and a burden from not addressing it. You have to find solutions as well. And that turns out to be much, much harder. And you have to find solutions that the public believes have costs in terms of implementing them that are going to justify the benefits that will be obtained. Because the failure to get the benefits to exceed the costs really leaves you in a bad place. And here's the challenge from an environmental point of view. We need energy. Our society wouldn't move, literally wouldn't move, if we didn't have energy. And we wouldn't have light and heat and a cooked breakfast. We would have a smoky fire like we had earlier today. That's where we would be if we didn't have our modern energy system. So don't tell people climate change is a big deal. Change, because they won't. I've looked at the data carefully, and the American public, by a 4-to-1 margin, prefers climate change to changing their patterns of behavior when it comes to energy. 4-to-1 margin. So we have a huge challenge, which is we need to make people understand the problem, but then deliver them solutions that they find better than the alternative of a status quo where we slowly build up the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and out over time cause perhaps irreparable damage to our planet and to our communities. But it is not a simple problem, and it's not simply a question of telling people there is a problem. I think the other thing that's very important as you think about change is to remember that the legacy of Martin Luther King is to think of many ways to climb the mountain. And that's an important lesson as well. There is not one answer. For those thinking about climate change 10 years ago, there seemed to be one answer. I was part of this one answer. Let's have a global treaty, tell everyone to reduce their emissions, and it will be done. That's what I call the 20th century approach to environment, which is a model of change called command and control. The government will command and control the problem. Turns out life is much messier. Hard to get that done, especially on a scale that is global and affects every element of society, every aspect of our economy and our lives. So we're going to have to do things differently. And when Governor Malloy invited me to take on this challenge of serving as Connecticut's Commissioner of Energy and Environmental Protection, I told the governor, I don't think we're going to succeed on climate change frontally. It looks to me like Washington's entirely broken down on this issue. And for those who know my family circumstance, it's actually ironic I tell you that, because my wife is a member of Congress, part of that broken down world. And I hear about it every weekend night when she's home. But I do want to say that I think creativity, innovation, and change in how we make change is critical to success. So here's what I said to the governor. You know, this is, frankly, Governor, not just a climate change problem. It's better understood as an energy problem. Better understood as requiring us to rethink our energy foundation of our society. And if we can get change moving on that front, I think you'll see change happening with regard to climate on a much better track, a much more sustainable track. So here's what we did. The governor asked for, and my department has delivered to him, a comprehensive energy strategy, emphasizing a set of things that I think will, over time, shift the structure of Connecticut's energy future and perhaps provide a model for society more broadly. First, we know, and again, I know here at Taft, you're thinking about this, that our best answer is to not consume energy wherever we can reduce our burdens. We have, therefore, a priority on energy efficiency. And in every sector, in our homes, in our offices, in our factories and industry. And it turns out there's a logic here, because if you can invest in energy efficiency, you can reduce the energy you consume, reduce pollution, and save money. And that's especially true if you're running a school and have to balance a budget, or running a factory and have to keep your products competitively priced. It matters to each and every one of us as we have family budgets to try to balance. So one of the things we've tried to do is to move from what I call light energy efficiency, literally changing out the light bulbs, maybe doing a little weather stripping, to deep energy efficiency, working on heating, lighting, air conditioning, the insulation in the roof, the windows, the systems, the furnaces, the boilers, everything including the Coke machine that consumes energy. Make it all more efficient. And suddenly you can move the efficiency progress from a 5 or 10% improvement to a 20 or a 30%. And that starts to be big, and that starts to be real. Second, we know we need to do more with renewable energy, but not just clean energy at any price. The key is clean energy at an ever lower price, because the real key to climate change, the transformative success, will come when we bring down the cost of alternative energy, clean power, below the cost of burning fossil fuels. That's the day we don't need a treaty, we don't need regulation, we don't need a command, because everyone in this room who's a decision maker on energy will say, you know what, I'll pick the cheaper option. And it may not happen instantly. It'll take time to change out the equipment, build the new infrastructure, but that's the day this problem will be addressed. So that's where I put my effort, bringing Connecticut more renewable energy at lower costs, and by bringing to bear some new policy tools, including competition for government projects, reverse auctions to bid down the price of how we buy power. We've been able to cut in half the cost of the renewable power that's being deployed in this state while taking up the scale tenfold. So let me repeat that. 10 times as many renewable power projects being done today as were done 3 years ago before Governor Malloy took office. And likewise, we're trying to buy power, renewable power, at a regional scale in new ways that will drive down the cost. And we just did a procurement of renewable power from across New England. And by using a reverse auction, again, this creative policy tool, asking people how low they would bid in terms of the power price they would charge us, we've been able to get a huge wind farm in Maine bid in to Connecticut's energy future at under 8 cents a kilowatt hour, which is just about at or maybe even a little below the price of energy more broadly. So we're getting close to that day when the renewable energy costs come in under the fossil fuel. We know that same change has to occur in the transportation sector. And again, I would tell you, you can't just tell people to drive a different car. You got to give them choices they like. So we're building out in Connecticut an infrastructure of alternative fuel options, electric vehicle charging stations, natural gas filling stations, even some hydrogen filling stations for those who are going to take the jump to the next generation of vehicles, which will be fuel cell vehicles. And all of that just to give you a choice so that when you buy your next car, you'll think, maybe it's time for an electric car. And we will in Connecticut, by the end of the next quarter, have built out enough publicly available electric vehicle charging stations, and I'm urging the headmaster to put one in right here, to ensure that anyone who's driving an electric car will be free from the worry that might hold people back, called range anxiety, the fear that you're going to run out of power. And if we have this infrastructure of what will be a couple of hundred publicly available stations, we won't have that worry here in the state of Connecticut. We need to as well address the reality of the other side of climate change, that it may be coming. So our fourth agenda item is resiliency, trying to build a smarter electric grid, more sensors so we can find outages. We need to build a system of more distributed power generation, not relying on a few big power plants, but a number of smaller power plants so that the grid goes down as it has 5 times on my watch. And let me tell you, it's not an easy day to be commissioner when 3/4 of the state has no power. I mean, especially when it lasts not just a few hours, and maybe in some cases not just a few days, but for a week. I can tell you at my home, on the first night we had no power in Storm Irene, my wife thought it was very charming. We camped out, put candles on the table. I grilled on the outside grill. Very romantic. Second day, she thought this is not so cool. And by the third day, she was saying, who the heck is the Commissioner of Energy in the state of Connecticut? So we do need to make ourselves more resilient. And in Connecticut, we're going to build a structure of microgrids. Again, distributed power generation, small-scale gas turbines or fuel cells, notable because they will be islandable, separatable from the grid in a crisis, and able to keep some number of essential services up and running. The other big change we're providing in Connecticut is that I think the key to success here is flowing money into this clean energy future, flowing money into efficiency, flowing money into renewable power at ever lower costs, flowing money into this distributed generation structure and microgrids, all of which required some new strategies. And therefore, one of the things I'm most proud of is that Connecticut has created a first-in-the-nation green bank, a special financing tool, a clean energy finance and investment authority designed to flow capital into all these projects using limited government money to leverage private sources of capital. It's doing phenomenal things, hundreds of millions of dollars now flowing to these projects at very low cost because we are aggregating projects, making the scale attractive, and de-risking these projects by providing a little bit of government support. So the key, again, in my mind, is to think differently about how we're going to deliver change. I am trying to get away from the government picking winners, the command and control model, to an approach that unleashes creativity, entrepreneurship, flows private resources in to develop options. And by the way, lots of these things will fail. But that's okay. We need to try a lot of things to find things that are going to work. So I'm excited about technology development, but innovation more broadly. Innovation in policy, innovation in incentives, innovation in how we finance our investments, innovation in marketing, innovation in outreach. How do we engage the public? All of this is the agenda for change that is required, in my mind, in the environmental arena. All of which is required if we are to address our environmental justice challenge. So let me close where I began by saying the job is not done, and I hope some of you in this room will take up this challenge. And remember that great quote from Martin Luther King, that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And I want to ask all of you to think, whether it's in this arena or any other, to pick an area of your own commitment to change and put your shoulder to the wheel and begin that bending process. Thank you.
We are all familiar with Dr. King's iconic 1963 I Have a Dream speech. But what's less known are the words directly preceding it. After a gospel selection by Miss Mahalia Jackson, a leading American rabbi, Joachim Prinz, a refugee from Nazi Germany, shared his perspective. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. How telling that Rabbi Prinz's remarks led directly into Dr. King's, as a determination not to be passive or indifferent engenders dreaming. A half a century since that day, we note marked progress. And yet, students, faculty, guests, and friends, we must not delude ourselves. This remains a broken world. But as Dr. King, Rabbi Prince, and others remind us, our task is to be allies, not bystanders, in the critical work of promoting justice, human dignity, and the environment. We must help to preserve this challenged yet precious world. Indeed, as today's organizers avow, that is the realization bringing us together this morning. And so, concluding this breakfast and preparing for the assembly, workshops, and beyond, let us dream as we pray. Source of life, Holy One of blessing, strengthen our determination to be true friends, to speak out and act against hatred, falsehood, degradation, and injustice. Finding inspiration and role models from the past, may our presence and our resolve link us closer to one another and to you. And let us say, Amen.
Thank you, Eric, for those words. Thank you, Commissioner, for the challenge and I think the expertise and the breadth of your vision and your service. To all of you, the civic and fire and police leaders from Watertown and Waterbury, many thanks for being part of this day. This is a terrific day for the school and I think for something much larger. And I come back to what the commissioner said, and that is that notion and that dream that maybe there's someone sitting at this table, at these tables, who might make the kind of change that you're talking about. So with that and with the sense of excitement about the rest of the day, we will adjourn and we will go to students and faculty, and all who can stay, we will be going to Bingham Auditorium at the end of the hall. Thank you.